that Qatar has committed to make significant strategic investments in Canada's nation-building projects. This capital will help the projects get built faster and supercharge our energy industries while helping to create thousands of high-paying careers for Canadians. After years of stalled negotiations, we're prioritizing a new investment promotion and protection agreement, which we'll finalize by this summer.
Nearly $500 billion. That's the scale of Qatar's sovereign wealth fund, now being positioned as a new source of investment for Canada. And with Mark Carney securing significant strategic commitments during his visit to Doha, billions of dollars in potential capital are suddenly on the table for Canada's energy systems, infrastructure, and advanced industries. In a year defined by U.S. tariffs and political unpredictability, this is not just another diplomatic handshake. It is a tectonic shift in where Canada's economic power might come from next. The move lands at a moment when Canada's traditional partnerships are strained, and when Washington's pressure campaign is reshaping supply chains across North America. What Carney brought home from Doha signals something Washington has long assumed Canada would never do: look elsewhere for ballast, leverage, and long-term financial security.
Prime Minister Mark Carney's first official trip to Doha produced a sweeping upgrade in the Canada-Qatar relationship. He met with the Emir, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, as well as senior ministers and the leadership of the Qatar Investment Authority, one of the wealthiest state funds in the world. Together, they announced that Canada and Qatar will now operate under a new strategic partnership framework, covering trade, investment, defense cooperation, labor mobility, technological exchange, and artificial intelligence. Carney confirmed that a foreign investment promotion and protection agreement will be finalized this summer. Once completed, Canadian companies will gain easier access to capital, while Qatari firms will receive stronger legal protections when investing in Canada. Negotiations are also starting on a double taxation agreement intended to support smoother cross-border employment and business expansion. At the same time, Qatar expressed clear interest in deploying major sovereign wealth fund resources into Canada's nation-building projects. These include both traditional and renewable energy, as well as large-scale infrastructure that has been slowed by financing challenges. The messaging from both governments was unmistakable. The partnership is no longer symbolic. It is designed to move money, talent, and strategic capacity in both directions. And the timing of the visit raises the stakes further. Carney arrived in Qatar only days after concluding a significant trade reset with China, and only days before he will share the stage with Donald Trump in Davos. Before entering that arena, he is stacking new partnerships one after another.
Now, as I think we all know, the global landscape is changing rapidly, leaving businesses and workers in a state of uncertainty. These changes are also undermining the effectiveness of our multilateral institutions on which middle powers like Canada and Qatar have historically relied. And in response, Canada is focused on what we can control, securing new trade and investment partnerships, so we're not reliant on a single country, but are stronger and more resilient to global shocks.
The Doha announcement instantly changes the strategic map for Canada-US relations. For months, Trump's second-term tariff barrage has disrupted Canadian exporters, squeezed entire industries, and created persistent uncertainty around the upcoming 2026 renegotiation of the USMCA. Carney's statement that Canada must focus on what we can control was not a polite diplomatic line. It was a declaration that Canada is no longer willing to absorb economic punishment from Washington without building its own counterweights. Qatar's investment power provides exactly that kind of counterweight. With access to a sovereign fund that dwarfs most national economies, Canada gains breathing room and, more importantly, negotiating room. Washington has long assumed Canada would never step outside the North American financial umbrella. This deal proves that assumption wrong.
The relevance of Qatar goes far beyond the immediate headline. A sovereign wealth fund of $500 billion does not operate like a commercial bank or private equity firm. It invests with long timelines, strategic goals, and geopolitical intent. For Canada, that kind of partnership can accelerate projects that have been stalled for years and support entire sectors where domestic capital has been too cautious or capacity limited. In practical terms, it means infrastructure can be built faster. Energy systems, both conventional and renewable, can scale beyond government budgets. Canada's emerging AI sector can attract global expertise with fewer financial constraints. These are not abstract benefits. They are the backbone of Canada's long-term competitiveness.
Carney understands the value of patient capital better than most leaders. His background as a central banker makes him a familiar figure to sovereign wealth funds like QIA, and this personal credibility is now converting into national advantage. Although Carney avoided naming Trump directly during his Doha press conference, the implication was vivid. He spoke of eroding traditional relationships, unpredictable global players, and the need for Canada to pursue resilience through diversification. In diplomatic language, this is as close as one comes to saying the U.S. is no longer dependable. For Washington, especially under Trump, this is uncomfortable territory. The U.S. expects loyalty from its closest trading partner, and historically, Canada has delivered it. But Carney is repositioning Canada from a predictable junior partner to a middle power acting in its own interest. This shift is subtle but strategic. It prepares Canada not just for the next tariff announcement, but for the next decade of geopolitical volatility. One element of the new partnership stood out in particular. Canada will appoint a defense attaché to Doha, while exploring security and technology cooperation with Qatar. For a country that hosts key U.S. military facilities and maintains deep ties with American intelligence networks, Qatar's role is highly sensitive. By opening a defense-adjacent channel with Qatar, outside of the predictable U.S.-NATO framework, Canada signals that it is no longer content to leave security diversification off the table. And that message, arriving just months before the USMCA review, puts the U.S. in an awkward position. Washington cannot easily dismiss Canada's new partnerships without undermining its own claims of respecting sovereign decision-making. Carney's broader strategy becomes even clearer when the Qatar deal is viewed alongside the China trip. In less than 2 weeks, he secured a trade opening with the world's largest exporter and investment interest from one of the world's richest states. Both moves expand Canada's leverage before Davos, where Trump will expect Canada to appear weakened. Instead, Canada will walk into Davos backed by Beijing's market scale and Doha's financial muscle. That is not a defensive posture. It is a middle power strategy executed with precision. Canada's partnership with Qatar is more than an economic agreement. It is a geopolitical signal. In a world where alliances are shifting and major powers are turning inward, Canada is choosing independence through diversification. The U.S. remains Canada's largest partner, but it is no longer Canada's only lifeline. As Carney prepares to meet Trump on the Davos stage, the question is no longer whether Canada can withstand American pressure. The real question is how Washington will respond now that Ottawa has options and the financial backing to use them. Canada has just rewritten the script. The United States now has to decide whether it wants to read it.
They have violated USMCA. We had certain protocols, side letters, agreements around the steel sector, around the auto sector and others, and what the U.S. has done in terms of those tariffs is not consistent with USMCA.
With the deal that you have.
The deal we have. Now,
Canada just crossed a line Ottawa has avoided for decades. In a year-end interview, Prime Minister Mark Carney openly accused the United States of violating USMCA, the continent's core trade agreement. And he didn't whisper it. He stated it plainly, calmly, and with the confidence of a leader who knows exactly where the leverage now lies. Carney also revealed that Canada and the U.S. aren't even in real trade talks yet. They are merely in what he called negotiations about negotiations, a phrase that tells you everything about the imbalance of urgency. Washington wants speed. Ottawa wants strategy. And for the first time in many years, Canada isn't the one blinking first. This is the moment the White House did not expect. The interview, conducted by Global News as part of Carney's first year in office recap, set an unusually direct tone for a Canadian Prime Minister. He reflected on taking the job in early 2025, stepping immediately into a full-scale trade confrontation with a second-term President Donald Trump. The year has been shaped by tariffs, threats, retaliatory measures, and a dramatic shift in how Washington views its allies. Carney said, without hesitation, that Trump's sweeping 2025 tariff package is inconsistent with the commitments the United States made under USMCA. These side agreements covering autos and steel were designed specifically to prevent exactly this type of unilateral action, yet Washington pushed ahead anyway, citing national security.
He then made it clear that formal negotiations haven't begun because Canada refuses to be rushed. The process, he explained, is still in the stage of determining what the negotiations will even cover. As Carney put it, with a hint of amusement, that's the way it works. What made the interview stand out, however, wasn't just the accusation. It was the quiet confidence behind it. Carney spoke as the leader of a country that has been strengthening its hand steadily over the past year, economically, diplomatically, and strategically.
Well, certainly a strategy is not to rush into a bad deal, and that's what we've been very disciplined about. And every week that goes by, the more that we're developing our economic strategy at home, the more we're developing those relationships abroad, the stronger we get.
Carney's remarks land differently in late 2025 than they would have in earlier years. The global landscape has shifted. Washington's policies have grown more transactional. Trump's second-term tariffs, the most extensive since the 1930s, according to AP and Bloomberg, have destabilized traditional alliances and forced countries to reconsider their dependencies. And while many nations scrambled, Canada chose a very different path: adaptation. Carney acknowledged something that Canadian governments have tiptoed around for decades. The United States is no longer the automatically reliable partner Canadians once assumed it to be. That realization didn't come from political rhetoric. It came from observing how quickly Washington was willing to disregard trade commitments when domestic politics demanded it.
Instead of reacting defensively, Carney began reshaping Canada's economic posture. One of the most consequential moves was the government's massive defense reinvestment, an $82 billion plan over 5 years. Unlike past decades when most of that spending inevitably flowed to U.S. contractors, this time the money stays home, building Canadian jobs, Canadian production capacity, and Canadian industrial resilience. For a president who demanded that NATO allies pay more, this is technically compliance, but of a kind that offers little benefit to the American defense sector. Simultaneously, Canada has moved to diversify its trade portfolio in a way not seen in a generation. Export growth into the European Union has strengthened under CETA. New partnerships are forming across ASEAN. The UAE announced major long-term investment commitments, positioning Canada as a preferred destination for clean energy development. Talks with Mercosur accelerated after Trump expanded tariff measures in the summer, prompting Reuters to note that Canadian exporters are preparing for a world where the U.S. can no longer be counted on as the predictable anchor of North American commerce.
What truly elevates Carney's strategy is how seamlessly it blends economic security with political realism. He is not simply diversifying for diversification's sake, he is building a Canada that cannot be cornered again by a single partner's political volatility. This approach forces Washington to confront a reality it has not faced in decades. Canada now has exit options. Whether it is critical minerals, defense manufacturing, LNG exports, or clean tech investment, Canada's value to the global economy is rising faster than America's leverage over it. For Trump, that shift is more threatening than any diplomatic statement. It means the old asymmetry is gone. What emerges from all this is a Canada that is not retreating from the world, but stepping into it more fully. It is a Canada that negotiates from a position of self-assurance rather than dependency. And that shift is precisely what allows Carney to sit across from the United States and refuse to accept a rushed, imbalanced deal. Carney's negotiations about negotiations line is more than a humorous aside. It signals that Ottawa understands the political clock in Washington. Trump faces midterms in 2026. U.S. farmers remain frustrated by reduced access to China. The Supreme Court is reviewing the legality of the tariff regime. Markets want predictability. The White House wants movement. Canada, however, wants terms that reflect its interests, and it has no reason to hurry. The diplomatic landscape is reinforcing this posture. Carney highlighted that Canada is participating in security coalitions in support of Ukraine that do not include the United States. Canada's growing relevance in these coalitions reflects a world in which influence is no longer monopolized by a single superpower. It also underscores that Ottawa is capable of shaping regional outcomes without relying on Washington's leadership. What's remarkable is how seamlessly this aligns with Carney's domestic agenda. By reducing reliance on the U.S. defense industry, strengthening trade with Asia and Europe, and positioning Canada as a reliable global partner at a moment when the U.S. is increasingly seen as unpredictable, he is turning external turbulence into internal opportunity. Carney's interview wasn't a critique. It was a declaration that Canada is no longer navigating from the passenger seat. Carney's decision to call out the U.S. for violating USMCA marks a turning point in North American trade politics. Canada is no longer the junior partner trying to preserve harmony at all costs. It is a nation with leverage, confidence, and alternative pathways. Trump's tariffs may have been intended to weaken Canada's negotiating position, but they appear to have achieved the opposite. They accelerated Canada's diversification, strengthened its domestic industries, and clarified its strategic objectives. The question now is not whether Canada can stand up to the United States. It already has. The question is how Washington responds when the country it once assumed would always fall in line now insists on playing by its own rules. As the 2026 USMCA review approaches, one thing is certain. Canada won't be entering the room quietly, and the United States won't be the one setting the pace.
Mr. Trump, in this recently released national security strategy, he does make a departure from generations of post-World War II U.S. leaders, more concerned about economic outcomes than principles like democracy. How problematic is that?
I think it's very problematic, but I also think it's not exactly new in the sense that we've been living with this since January 6th, and we've been living with the consequences of it as it relates, obviously, with our trade relationship. Wake up, Canadians. We need to understand what we're dealing with here and the kind of excesses that this rhetoric can give rise to.
Donald Trump's new national security strategy has dropped, and it's creating a political shockwave across Canada. Not because it offers clarity, and certainly not because it strengthens alliances, but because it openly declares that America will discourage collaboration with others and expects countries like Canada to fall in line. This isn't the language of partnership, it's the language of hierarchy, and Canada is no longer pretending otherwise. The debate erupted after Bob Rae, Canada's former ambassador to the United Nations, broke his silence and described the strategy as very problematic. In his view, Trump's approach represents a decisive shift away from the post-World War II American tradition of shared security, collective responsibility, and respect for allies. Instead, the new document reframes national security almost entirely around economic dominance and unilateral advantage. Rae reminds Canadians that this change didn't begin today. Since Trump's return to the White House in early 2025, Canada has been caught in the crosshairs of an increasingly aggressive U.S. posture, from sudden tariff hikes to political pressure ahead of the 2026 USMCA review. Now, Trump's written doctrine confirms what many had already sensed. Washington's priority is no longer the stability of its alliances, but the pursuit of its own short-term leverage. And it comes at a moment when Prime Minister Mark Carney is moving Canada toward greater strategic independence, deepening partnerships in Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and Latin America. The most striking feature of Trump's strategy is the contradiction at its core. On one hand, it signals that the United States no longer intends to play the same stabilizing role it has held for generations. On the other, it insists that allies should avoid forming new partnerships elsewhere. In simple terms, Washington is saying, "We are stepping back, but you are not allowed to step forward." Rae points out that this mindset undermines decades of trust. Canada, he argues, cannot be expected to remain passive while the U.S. withdraws from its commitments. A country of Canada's size, capability, and global significance simply won't accept an arrangement where it is expected to obey rules that no longer bind the party imposing them.
Ray is blunt. Canada has never been, and will never be, a vassal state, and in 2025 that position is stronger than ever. Canada has emerged as a clean energy powerhouse, a critical minerals supplier essential to global manufacturing, a central part of North America's energy security, and a rising force in AI regulation and digital governance. Under Mark Carney, Canada is deliberately broadening its economic and security relationships, strengthening ties with Germany, South Korea, Japan, and the European Union, and preparing long-term partnerships that situate Canada as a stable, predictable middle power in an increasingly unpredictable world. So when the United States demands that Canada limit its collaboration with these very partners, it directly contradicts the direction Canada has chosen. The answer, politically and strategically, is no. Ray also highlights the deeper issue. Trump's worldview places pure self-interest above everything, including the interests of America's closest allies. Over the past year, Canada has already experienced the consequences of this approach. Tariffs have been used as political tools, not economic policies. U.S. companies have shifted investments based on political pressure rather than market logic. Trade threats have become routine, even when American industries depend heavily on Canadian supply chains. This strategy may energize Trump's domestic supporters, but it undermines the very alliances that have defined North American prosperity and security for generations. And, as Ray notes, it creates a world where trust erodes quickly, and where even long-standing partners begin to doubt America's intentions.
One of the most contentious parts of Trump's strategy is the call to discourage collaboration with others. For Canada, this doesn't just affect trade, it affects national defense. Ottawa is currently exploring next-generation fighter aircraft beyond the U.S. market, evaluating submarine proposals from Germany and South Korea, and establishing deeper defense ties in the Indo-Pacific. Canada's shift isn't ideological, it's practical. In a world of shifting power, no country can rely on a single partner for every strategic need. Trump's strategy, however, frames such diversification as disloyal. But in Ray's view, any Canadian government with self-respect must defend its sovereign right to choose its partners based on Canada's interests, not America's political cycles. And in 2025, that principle matters more than ever.
The strategy also outlines a willingness to support foreign political movements aligned with Washington, even when they conflict with the elected governments of allied nations. This shift raises global concerns, particularly in Europe, where governments worry that the United States under Trump may choose short-term ideological victories over long-term stability. Ray warns that this approach invites chaos. Abandoning Ukraine, undermining European governments, and escalating geopolitical tensions in Asia do not serve the long-term interests of democracies, including the United States itself. In an era of rising authoritarianism, the idea that America would reduce its support for democratic allies is deeply troubling. And this is precisely where Canada emerges as a counterweight. While the U.S. debates its commitments, Canada has doubled down on multilateralism, building bridges in regions that value steady partnerships. The contrast between Canada's approach and Trump's is becoming more noticeable and more consequential by the day.
Ironically, Trump's attempt to centralize American power risks weakening it. By pressuring allies, he pushes them into new alliances. By discouraging collaboration, he encourages them to diversify. By demanding loyalty without offering stability, he accelerates the creation of a world where middle powers, Canada among them, act more independently. The result is simple. The more Washington tries to restrict Canada's options, the more options Canada chooses to create.
Trump's national security strategy isn't just another policy document. It is a declaration of a new American posture.
unilateral, transactional, and willing to place pressure on allies to secure short-term gains. But Canada is no longer operating in that world. As Bob Rae makes clear, Canada will push back when necessary, speak honestly when the situation demands it, and defend its national interests without apology. The question now is not whether Canada can adapt to this new U.S. strategy. Canada already has. The real question is whether the United States understands the long-term cost of alienating its closest partner, and whether Trump realizes that Canada is not the country he remembers from past decades. Canada is charting its own course. Washington can either respect that reality or watch its influence fade as allies look elsewhere.
If there is the preeminence of the United States, does that necessarily relegate Canada to a secondary role?
Well, unless Canada wants to, Canada is not going to be I think it would be difficult for Canada to become the preeminent military power and economic power in the world. Okay? I think what this says is we want America and our close allies, and we have no closer economic ally or a military ally than Canada.
After hearing the U.S. ambassador openly suggest that Canada will never be the preeminent economic or military power, the real question isn't whether Canada is being pushed into a secondary role, it's why Washington feels the need to say it out loud. When an American ambassador emphasizes U.S. dominance right before a critical trade renegotiation, he isn't offering reassurance, he's signaling hierarchy. And that hierarchy is exactly what this moment exposes. Donald Trump's tariff blitz, his emotional reaction to a single Ontario advertisement, and his insistence on U.S. preeminence all point to one thing. Washington is no longer negotiating with Canada as a partner, but attempting to manage Canada as a subordinate. But Canada today is not the Canada of past trade battles. And this time the imbalance is not as one-sided as the United States believes. The drama began when ongoing trade talks between Prime Minister Mark Carney's government and the Trump administration were suddenly thrown off course. U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra revealed something extraordinary. The negotiations were close, very close, to a breakthrough on steel, aluminum, energy, even autos. Then one thing happened. A provincial advertisement from Ontario aired during the World Series referenced tariffs and used Ronald Reagan's own words. That was enough to set off the president. Within hours, the mood inside Washington flipped. The deal collapsed. Phone calls were made across continents, and Trump's team abruptly shifted from cooperation to confrontation. Canada held firm. Ottawa refused to apologize, refused to retreat, and simply stated the talks would resume when appropriate. Even in this tense environment, Canada delivered a trade surplus with the United States, driven by resilient exports in metals and transportation equipment. At the same time, Trump escalated by threatening new tariffs on Canadian fertilizer, a lifeline input for U.S. farmers already facing rising costs and falling margins. And he confirmed that the era of tariff-free trade in North America is over. This is the political weather system Canada is operating in, unpredictable, emotional, and increasingly unilateral. Washington's reaction to a single provincial ad tells us something fundamental about the current U.S. administration. Its negotiating posture is fragile. A mature government doesn't walk away from a near-finalized trade deal because of a 30-second message aired by a regional government, but this White House did. Trump's response wasn't strategic, it was personal. The ambassador practically admitted that everything fell apart because the president felt targeted. That level of emotional volatility is a problem, but not for Canada. It is a problem for the United States because it signals to every trading partner on Earth that deals can collapse at any moment for reasons unrelated to economics or diplomacy. Ottawa, by contrast, remained calm. The Carney government did not escalate the rhetoric, did not match the outrage and did not turn diplomacy into theater. That contrast, discipline versus impulsiveness, quietly strengthened Canada's position. The second major takeaway is even clearer. The United States intends to place tariffs on Canada, regardless of the negotiating framework. Ambassador Hoekstra didn't hide it. He said that tariffs will form part of any future arrangement and that free trade doesn't exist. That admission matters. It means Canada is no longer facing a technical trade disagreement, it is facing a structural shift in American doctrine. Washington now believes tariffs are the default setting, not the exception.
And when Trump says the U.S. must remain preeminent, the message between the lines is unmistakable. Canada is expected to play the supporting role while America plays the lead. That's not partnership, that's hierarchy. And hierarchies have consequences. For Canada, it confirms that the next phase of the U.S.-Canada relationship will require not deference, but strategy. What Washington fails to recognize is that modern economic power is no longer measured by who declares preeminence, but by who controls future critical inputs and industrial stability. Canada's command over clean electricity, critical minerals, freshwater capacity, and cross-border auto components gives it a quietly compounding advantage that isn't captured by political slogans. Preeminence in the 21st century belongs to the country that can guarantee reliable production, not the one that shouts the loudest. Trump's insistence on hierarchy only highlights how outdated his economic lens has become, and how much leverage Canada actually holds in the next industrial cycle.
The auto industry is the next battleground. Trump wants to cap Canadian vehicle exports and introduce quotas, arguing that the United States must make cars and make money making cars. But the North American auto ecosystem is deeply integrated, and tariffs don't just hurt Canada. They raise prices for American consumers, disrupt U.S. assembly lines, and undermine competitive advantage against Europe and Asia. Ottawa understands this, and that is why Canada's countermessage has been consistent. Cooperation benefits both economies. Coercion does not. Canada's real counterweight to Trump isn't diversification. It's the structure of the North American auto industry itself. Hoekstra openly admitted that the United States imports far more Canadian-built vehicles than it exports, and that Washington's new tariff-first mindset cannot simply rewrite those realities. Modern auto manufacturing relies on an intricate cross-border ballet of components: steel frames stamped in Ontario, aluminum chassis poured in Quebec, engine modules assembled in Windsor, and electronics shipped back and forth across the Ambassador Bridge every single day. Any attempt by Trump to impose caps or quotas would not merely inconvenience Canada, it would choke U.S. assembly lines within weeks. Canada's leverage isn't political theater, it's baked into the architecture of the auto supply chain, and Trump's threats only highlight how dependent Detroit truly is on Canadian stability. There is also a structural advantage Canada holds that almost no one in Washington seems prepared to acknowledge: freshwater. Hoekstra briefly mentioned that over 200 municipalities across the two countries rely on shared water systems, calling freshwater the oil of the next 20 years. What he didn't say is how central water is to the next phase of auto manufacturing. Electric vehicle plants, microchip fabs, and battery facilities consume staggering amounts of water. As the EV transition accelerates, water becomes industrial currency, and Canada has more of it than any advanced economy on the continent. No tariff can change geography. If auto production is shifting toward high water demand processes, Canada's natural resource advantage transforms into a long-term competitive edge that neither tariffs nor quotas can neutralize. So here's where we stand: a president whose negotiating style can be thrown off by a single advertisement, a White House that openly states tariffs on Canada are unavoidable, a doctrine of American preeminence that leaves no space for equal partnership, and an auto and fertilizer strategy that risks harming U.S. workers more than Canadian ones. Canada isn't simply enduring this moment, it's redefining itself through it. The question now is simple: Will Canada use this disruption to fully reshape its economic future away from dependence on Washington? Or will the United States eventually realize that a stable, respected, and prosperous Canada is not a threat, but its most valuable ally? The next chapter of North American trade will not be written by emotion. It will be written by strategy. And right now, Canada is playing the smarter game.